Welcome to our deep dive into modern chivalry. You've provided some fascinating excerpts from this book, so it seems you're keen on exploring early American culture and satire, and perhaps the quirks of language from that era.
Indeed, modern chivalry offers a captivating glimpse into the late 1700s and early 1800s in America. It's a satirical novel by Hugh Henry Brackenridge. And instead of just relaying the plot, we'll be dissecting intriguing passages, like you said, and their historical and societal context.
Okay, let's unpack this. One passage jumped out at me. The author's almost enraged take on the use of Latin sprinkled in English texts. He compares it to encountering rubbish in a conversation.
Right.
Now, this isn't just a funny observation, is it? It seems to hint at something deeper about education and literacy in early America.
You're absolutely right. This frustration wasn't just about linguistic preference. No, it reflects a fascinating tension of the time. Was Latin clinging to its status as a mark of sophistication even as English literacy was spreading? This was a period of immense societal change, and the very way knowledge was presented and accessed was being challenged.
So was this a form of gatekeeping knowledge, reserving it for a select few? Almost feels like a parallel to how we view specialized jargon today. Sometimes it clarifies, and sometimes it just seems to obfuscate. The author brings up St. Paul, who supposedly knew many languages but chose to communicate simply and effectively.
Precisely. The author seems to champion clear and accessible communication, right? He argues that using convoluted language isn't about clarity, it's about control. And interestingly, he even highlights the potential consequences of this by introducing us to a character who embodies this disconnect between knowledge and ability. Tigo Regan. He's constantly being thrust into positions of power, like a judge or even governor, roles he's completely ill-suited for.
Now, Keeg seems like a real piece of work, always stumbling into trouble. But I have to ask, is his character just for laughs, or is Brackenridge making a larger point? Was he subtly commenting on the dangers of unqualified leadership in a fledgling democracy, or perhaps even the fickleness of public opinion? Early American democracy was still finding its footing.
Absolutely, and Teague's antics aren't just comedic relief. He seems to embody the very anxieties people had about this new system of governance. Remember, this was a time when the idea of mob rule was a genuine concern. Were the masses truly equipped to choose capable leaders? Brackenridge seems to be using satire to poke at those anxieties, making us question, maybe even laugh at, the very foundations of this bold experiment that was American democracy.
There's this one scene where Teague actually attacks the courtroom with a constable's staff. It's outrageous, but also makes you wonder, were incidents like this perhaps less dramatic but equally absurd happening in this new, untested system?
Indeed. And this brings us to another fascinating theme. The tension between practical experience and theoretical knowledge. The book seems to champion practical sense over abstract theories, especially when it comes to governing a nation. After all, you can't just theorize your way out of a frontier crisis.
But what exactly constitutes common sense in this context? It feels like a loaded term, doesn't it? Is it just street smarts, or is there something deeper at play?
It's a great question. I think this ties into the influence of Enlightenment thought on early America. You have this burgeoning nation grappling with reason and logic, but also the harsh realities of forging a new society. Common sense, as Brackenridge seems to define it, was about the wisdom gleaned from experience, from facing challenges head on, not just reading about them in some fancy European treatise. It was about bridging the gap between intellectual ideals and the practical demands of building a nation.
So it's less about book smarts and more about a kind of grounded wisdom. The kind you'd find in a skilled farmer or frontiersman, someone who knew how to get things done. There's a passage where the author praises a farmer's practical knowledge over a philosopher's theories, almost as if to say, forget the fancy ideas, show me what works.
Exactly. And this preference for practical experience might seem like common sense to us now, but in a time when America was trying to define itself intellectually and philosophically, this was a bold statement. Brackenridge is essentially saying that true knowledge is tested and proven in the real world, not just debated in salons.
But then here's where things get really interesting. He takes this seemingly straightforward idea of common sense and applies it to something much more radical, voting rights. He goes so far as to suggest that even animals should be allowed to vote.
Yes, it's an absolutely absurd proposition. A cow at the ballot box, can you imagine? But this is where Brackenridge's satirical genius shines through. He's not simply advocating for animal suffrage, he's using this outlandish idea to critique the very notion of uninformed voting.
So it's less about letting chickens choose the next president and more about forcing us to confront a crucial question. What constitutes a responsible and informed electorate? And does expanding voting rights without considering this lead to chaos? He even has this scene where a man tries to vote for his horse, highlighting the absurdity.
You've hit the nail on the head. He's using humor to expose a potentially serious flaw in the democratic ideal. After all, if any decision is as good as the next, is democracy really serving its purpose? It's a thought-provoking question that has continued to be debated throughout American history and is still relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, what would Brackenridge make of modern-day voter demographics and political discourse?
Well, that's a discussion for another time, perhaps, but it's clear that Breckinridge, even back then, understood the complexities and the potential pitfalls of a system that relies on the judgment of the masses.
And he wasn't afraid to use humor, even absurdity, to expose those complexities. It's fascinating how relevant these issues still feel today, centuries after modern chivalry was first published.
Indeed. It seems that some questions about human nature, governance, and the very way we value knowledge are timeless, transcending centuries and societal shifts. And Brackenridge's work offers us a unique and entertaining way to explore those questions. It's fascinating how Brackenridge manages to layer his satire. On one hand, you have these absurd scenarios like a horse being put forward as a candidate for office. But beneath the surface, he's sparking a genuine conversation about the nature of leadership and the qualifications we should demand.
It's like he's saying, if you're going to let just anyone lead, shouldn't we at least be sure they understand the job better than a farm animal? It's a sharp critique delivered with a wink and a nudge, making you chuckle while also prompting some serious reflection.
Exactly. And that's the brilliance of his approach. He's not just preaching or moralizing. He's inviting you to think for yourself, to question assumptions, and to perhaps see the humor in the often absurd ways we organize our society.
And this satirical lens isn't just pointed at politics. He also seems to have a lot to say about the different ways we value knowledge. We've already talked about his preference for practical skills over book learning, but I'm curious, was this a common sentiment in early America? Was there a distrust of intellectual elites, especially in a society that was still figuring out its own identity?
It's a great question, and I think the answer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. Remember, this was a time of immense change and upheaval. America was in the process of defining itself, not just politically, but also intellectually and culturally. There was a sense that traditional forms of knowledge, those imported from Europe, didn't necessarily apply to the unique challenges of building a new nation in the wilderness.
So it wasn't necessarily anti-intellectualism, but rather a push for a different kind of knowledge, one that was grounded in the realities of the American experience.
Precisely. It was a recognition that the skills needed to survive and thrive in this new environment weren't always found in books or university lecture halls. It was the farmer, the blacksmith, the frontiersman who possessed the practical know-how that was truly valuable.
And Brackenridge seems to be highlighting this through characters like Teague, who, despite his lack of formal education, often displays a kind of shrewdness and resourcefulness that puts those with more book learning to shame.
Absolutely. Think about that scene where Teague manages to talk his way out of a sticky situation with a group of Native Americans using a mix of broken language and sheer audacity. He might not have been able to quote Cicero, but he understood something fundamental about human nature and the art of persuasion.
It's a reminder that intelligence comes in many forms, isn't it? And that sometimes street smarts can be just as valuable as academic credentials.
Exactly. And Brackenridge isn't afraid to turn this critique inward, poking fun at those who use their education as a shield or a weapon, rather than a tool for genuine understanding. He has this hilarious passage where he describes encountering a man who can barely string together a coherent sentence in English, yet insists on peppering his speech with Latin phrases.
It's like he's saying, don't just parrot what you've read.
Yeah.
Actually understand it and be able to communicate it in a way that's meaningful.
You've got it. He's advocating for clarity, for accessibility, for a kind of intellectual humility that values true understanding over empty displays of erudition.
Now, one thing that struck me about modern chivalry is its unique structure. It's not a traditional novel with a linear plot. It's more like a series of interconnected episodes, almost like a picaresque tale.
That's a great observation. It's almost as if Brackenridge is taking us on a grand tour of early American society, with each episode offering a glimpse into a different facet of life, from the halls of government to the rowdy taverns of the frontier.
And our guides on this journey are Captain Farrago, a man of education and refinement, and Teague Regan, his ever-bumbling servant. It's not pairing, wouldn't you say?
It is, and I think that's intentional. Their contrasting personalities and perspectives allow Brackenridge to explore a wide range of themes and social dynamics. Captain Farrago represents the voice of reason and enlightenment, while Teague embodies the more chaotic and unpredictable aspects of human nature.
And together they stumble into all sorts of absurd situations, exposing the hypocrisies and contradictions of the society around them. It's almost like a comedic duo act, with Teague providing the slapstick and Farrago offering the wry commentary.
You've hit the nail on the head, and I think that comedic dynamic is crucial to the book's effectiveness. It allows Brackenridge to address serious issues, social inequality, political corruption, the abuse of power, without becoming preachy or didactic.
He's making us laugh, but he's also making us think.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful combination, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's a technique that's still relevant today. Think about how modern satirists use humor to address social and political issues. Shows like The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight come to mind. They make us laugh, but they also challenge us to think critically about the world around us.
Now, we've talked a lot about Teague's role as a satirical device, but I'm curious, do you think there's more to his character than just being a source of comic relief?
I think there is. While he's often portrayed as a bumbling fool, he also possesses a certain cunning and resourcefulness. Remember how he managed to convince those frontiersmen that he was a renowned physician despite having no medical knowledge?
That's right. And he even managed to pull off a few cures through sheer luck and audacity. It's those moments that make you wonder if Brackenridge is hinting at something more complex, perhaps a commentary on the nature of authority itself.
I think you're onto something. Teague's ability to rise to positions of power despite his obvious lack of qualifications speaks to the often arbitrary nature of authority. He's a walking, talking example of how easily people can be swayed by appearances, by charisma, by a well-timed lie or a bit of flattery.
It's a reminder that power isn't always earned or deserved. Sometimes it's simply stumbled into, like Teague tripping over a pot of gold.
Exactly. And that raises some uncomfortable questions about how we choose our leaders, doesn't it? Are we looking for genuine competence and integrity, or are we susceptible to the same kind of superficial judgments that allow someone like Teague to rise through the ranks?
It makes you wonder if Brackenridge is subtly suggesting that we're all a bit more gullible than we'd like to admit, that we're all prone to falling for a good story or a charming rogue even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
That's a provocative thought, isn't it? And it's a question that's still relevant today. Just look at how often we see figures in positions of authority who seem to have risen to their positions through charisma or connections rather than through genuine merit.
It's as if Brackenridge is whispering across the centuries, reminding us to be wary of those who claim to have all the answers to question authority and to look beyond the surface when making judgments about those in power.
And it's not just about political leadership. This applies to all aspects of life, doesn't it? We see it in the business world, in academia, even in our personal relationships. We're constantly bombarded with messages designed to influence our perceptions, to shape our opinions, to make us believe certain narratives.
It's a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, to question what we see and hear, to form our own judgments based on evidence and reason, not just on appearances or emotional appeals.
You're absolutely right. And modern chivalry offers us a valuable tool for developing that critical lens. It teaches us to see the humor in the absurd, to question assumptions, and to recognize the often hidden agendas at play in the ways we construct our world.
And it does all of this while making us laugh along the way.
Exactly. Brackenridge understood that humor can be a powerful weapon, not just for entertainment, but for social commentary and intellectual exploration. He's inviting us to laugh at ourselves, at our follies, at the often absurd ways we navigate the complexities of life.
As we wrap up our exploration of modern chivalry, one thing that really stands out is how Brackenridge tackles this whole idea of democracy.
Yeah.
He seems to have this kind of like love-hate relationship with it, seeing both its incredible potential and its, inherent weaknesses.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it? I mean, remember, he was writing at a time when America was still figuring itself out, right? Like the ink was barely dry on the Constitution, and the whole idea of a government by the people was still a pretty radical experiment.
Right. And he seems to be wrestling with those anxieties, poking fun at the ways in which power can be misused, how easily the masses can be swayed, and how those lofty ideals of democracy can sometimes, well, clash with the realities of human nature.
Absolutely. Like, take those scenes where Teague gets pushed into these positions of authority that he's clearly not ready for. It's hilarious, sure, but there's a deeper point there, right? It's like Brackenridge is saying, hey, if we're not careful, We could end up with a government run by a bunch of Tigo Regans.
It makes you wonder what he would make of our modern political landscape. With all the partisan gridlock, the rise of social media and the spread of misinformation, it's almost as if some of his fears about the fragility of democracy are playing out right before our eyes.
Yeah, it's a bit unsettling, isn't it? I mean, Brackenridge seems to be warning us that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something that requires active participation, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
So what can we, as modern readers, take away from modern chivalry to help us navigate these challenges? What wisdom, what insights can we glean from a book written over 2 centuries ago that might be relevant to our lives today?
Well, for one thing, I think it reminds us that we should never take our freedoms for granted. Democracy is a fragile thing. It requires constant care and attention, and it's up to each of us to be informed, engaged citizens.
And to never stop questioning, right? To be critical thinkers who can see through the spin and the hype and make up our own minds about the world around us.
Exactly. Brackenridge seems to be saying, don't just accept what you're told, look for the evidence, think for yourself, and don't be afraid to challenge those in power.
That's a powerful message, isn't it? And it's one that feels incredibly timely in our current climate. So as we wrap up our deep dive into modern chivalry, I think the big question is this. If Breckinridge were alive today, what aspects of modern society would he satirize?
Oh, that's a fun one to think about. I mean, given his sharp wit and his ability to skewer human folly, I imagine he'd have a field day with our obsession with celebrity culture, the 24/7 news cycle, maybe even the whole world of online dating apps.
And yet, I think his core message about the importance of critical thinking, common sense, and a healthy dose of skepticism would still resonate with audiences today, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, human nature hasn't really changed all that much, right? We're still susceptible to the same follies, the same vanities, the same thirst for power and recognition.
It's writers like Breckinridge who can hold up a mirror to those foibles, make us laugh at ourselves, and hopefully inspire us to be a little bit better, a little bit wiser, a little bit more thoughtful in our choices.
I couldn't agree more. Modern chivalry is a reminder that we can approach the world with both a critical eye and a sense of humor, that we can question authority without losing our sense of hope, and that we can engage in meaningful dialogue even when we disagree.
So if you're looking for a book that'll make you laugh, make you think, and maybe even make you question a few of your assumptions about the world, I highly recommend checking out Modern Chivalry. It's a wild, insightful ride, and you just might be surprised at how relevant it feels to our own time.
It's a classic for a reason, right? And it's a reminder that sometimes the best way to understand the present is to look to the past.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into modern chivalry. Thanks for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of early American satire, and we encourage you to continue exploring these themes and ideas on your own.